In Charlotte Bronte's classic novel Jane Eyre, there is a heavy presence of books and the reading of them. In this video, I'm going to primarily analyze the act of reading, in a physical sense and in a person as a book sense, people reading per se. Let's start with some background information. The Victorians were obsessed with the notion of work and duty. They considered the mind and body as interdependent, with the mind given a higher priority. In fact, it was believed that a healthy mind could make up for a flaw or weakness in the physical body. For an activity to be considered as spiritually helpful, the work component was required. Likewise, working on staying healthy was perceived as not only a private concern, but also as a patriotic obligation. Like their predecessors, the Victorians strongly believed that the female nature was highly sensitive, imaginative, and more empathetic. With this delicate, more refined nature came a vulnerability that made them more prone to emotional imbalance, which led to physical illness. The people of that day responded to literary texts in a more emotional way than we do. It was common to display the feelings evoked from a certain work when reading in public, as well as in private settings. For the same reason, it was feared that solitary, unmonitored reading by women could affect their health and moral character. They would end up sick, sad, teary, confused, desirous, and depraved, with no chance for a good marriage or a happy life. At the other end of things, there were some who viewed reading as a source of autonomy for women. This is very evident in Jane Eyre. Beginning with the line, "There was no possibility of taking a walk that day," we are led into a description of a young girl's consolatory reading. Sitting in a window behind heavy red curtains, Jane picks out Bewick's History of the British Birds, to peruse. Her reflection of Bewick is interrupted when her cousin John Reed assaults her and questions her right to read the book that he claims as his property. In this scene, Jane's vulnerability, as well as her strength, is displayed. She refuses to be beaten into submission. The understanding she has gained from her readings allow her to rise above the limitations of her position. A poor orphan dependent on her relatives. Drawing a parallel between John and Roman tyrants, she exposes him for what he is and asserts her right to resist abuse. Even when she gets punished for her defiance, she firmly holds on to her rights. Thus, from the outset, Jane's private reading is confirmed to be a source of inner strength and self-preservation, rather than a form of escape or daydreaming. With her arrival at Lowood, Jane's real life begins. Though Lowood represents the worst of educational institutions of the day, Jane manages to pull through. Within the confines of the school, she becomes friends with Helen and Miss Temple. They offer her more than friendship. Indeed, they show her scholarly companionship. Thus, by contrasting reading as a mindless institutional requirement with meaningful absorption with texts, the Lowood chapter of Jane's life asserts that the latter creates a perfect environment for introspection, spiritual growth, comfort, and intimacy. When she starts working as a governess at Thornfield, and consequently falls in love with Mr. Rochester, Jane discovers many beautiful new aspects of her life. She finally knows what it feels like to be acknowledged, understood, and loved by an intellectual equal. When Jane was a confined child reading History of the British Birds, Mr. Rochester was busy reading Shakespeare and traveling Europe. With his worldly knowledge and experience, he places Jane in a situation where she is an open book, susceptible to his scrutiny, while her own vision is obscured. Once Mr. Rochester's plot comes out, Jane is faced with a difficult decision, either to stay and through her emotional and intuitive passion to save her dignity and uphold her virtue. Ultimately, Jane's emotional self ends with her fleeing from it. The Morehouse segment of Jane's life is perhaps the most critical moment in the story. It marks the final phase of her personal growth. After nearly dying from pure exhaustion, Jane seeks the Rivers house. She finds the sisters reading and discussing a text in German. When she actually gains entrance into the Moore house, she is received into their lives. Her stay, though, is challenged by St. John's despotism. Passion is something he denies himself and others. As Jane observes, St. John uses the literal act of reading as a way for intense observation of others. Manipulative, he uses his strong persuasive skills to make Jane abandon her study of German, and instead makes her learn Hindustani. In the end, when St. John proposes to her, Jane listens to her emotional self instead and rushes to find her lover. The last pages of the novel show Jane in full control of her destiny and her story. Her journey ends with her reunion with Mr. Rochester. Jane is no longer poor or lonely. Having found her family and received her inheritance, she is financially independent. She becomes her husband's guide, and even though Mr. Rochester later gains partial eyesight, he literally sees the world through her, like the accurately written pages of the Book of Life. In the end, it is their intellectual and affective affinity that makes them perceptive readers of each other and the world. In conclusion, Charlotte Brontë demonstrates that reading is actually nourishing and empowering in contrast to the ideals of the people of her day. Jane Eyre demonstrates that women gain intimacy, self-worth, comfort, independence, and knowledge through the literal and figurative act of reading.